Vicki Goplin. We were talking about having a conversation here in our mostly white church about racism and what it means to us and what is the reality of racism still. And Vicki Goplin said, "I know just the two people that we should invite to talk. Mary Hess, who teaches at Luther Seminary, and Eric Goplin." And how does she know you? Distant relative. Who teaches in the St. Paul Public Schools. And unfortunately, Vicki is sick today and isn't able to be here, and so is, I'm sure, very disappointed that she can't be here. But in a moment, they're going to come up, and they've talked, and they know what they're doing, and they're going to have a conversation with each other, and we'll look forward to that. And I thought I would frame the conversation a little bit by reading a couple verses from Galatians. This is Paul. "Now before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Therefore the law was our disciplinarian until Christ came, so that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian. For in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise."
Hello.
Hello. We thought one of the things we could do is ask each other a couple of questions to get ourselves started, and then invite all of you to become part of the conversation. So can I start with you?
Sure.
So Eric has been, as you know, as is said in the announcements, a teacher in the St. Paul Public Schools, and over the last couple of years, there's some pretty dramatic shifts that have happened, and so I wanted you to talk a little bit about your experience and what's been going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually not a teacher. I'm a teaching assistant in the St. Paul Public Schools, just to put that out there.
All kinds of teaching happens.
Yeah, I when I was asked to kind of talk, I wanted to touch on kind of the old model for special education and sort of the new model that started this year and why those changes happened. And so the old model for special ed in St. Paul, when I say special ed, I'm talking about emotional and behavioral disorders, or predominantly the students that I work with. And the old model was that these kids were taken out of their classrooms and put in small classrooms that were up to 10 kids, one teacher and two support staff, so really high student-to-staff ratio. And the concept was that they were going to relearn social behaviors and relearn some of the behaviors they need to join the general ed classrooms. And the truth of the matter was that wasn't happening. The threshold to get back into the gen ed population were these kind of arbitrary 90% behavior goals
Really high.
that nobody could meet. Yeah, right. And so the system we had created, the sad truth is that we had said, you're going to be taken out of the pool and you're going to go into your own pool that's not a very nice pool, and it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to get out of. And so the St. Paul schools this year took a very courageous step and identified the fact that we are failing these students. And when we look at who are these students are 95% black male students, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's very difficult to admit that that's a problem, and it's hard to say, well, we are institutionalizing this racism, and we're part of the problem. But the St. Paul schools have taken a pretty bold step and said, we are failing these students, just full stop, we're failing the students. And so the bold step here this year is that these students are now in general ed classrooms. There's a lot of support. It hasn't been perfect, but it has been incredible to see some of the turnarounds that has happened. So I work at the Barack and Michelle Obama Service Learning School. It's a mouthful even for me to say, and I work there. Where our school has the highest percentage of African American students in St. Paul, very high poverty rate. And so now that we've kind of made this big change, we're seeing pretty big academic gains, behavior gains that people didn't really think was possible. And it really started with identifying the racial piece. And that was really what got the conversation moving, was that the failure here is a racial issue and not just, there are many other issues, and so that's kind of been the big step, and it's been a success so far. And so we're pretty proud of what we're doing. And as teachers, I think we feel kind of a renewed spirit towards special education, which can be difficult at times, especially emotional behavioral disorder students. But yeah, a lot of success. So we're feeling pretty good about that this year. And so we kind of talked a little bit before too, and kind of I'm curious about your experiences, and you're in working in an integration district, and some of kind of the myths that you've come across with race, and how you've engaged those myths.
Yeah, I think this ties in especially to the stories you were just telling, and some of what we said last week. So I've been active in the East Metro Integration District, which is the St. Paul public schools and the surrounding suburban district schools, working on integration issues. And one of the things that I think we've found in that process is that how very much important it is to recognize that when there are differences, when there's, so this achievement gap, I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit, because that's been all over the news lately, that we have these huge achievement gaps. And I think one of the things that it's important for all of us to ask, especially those of us who, like last week when we talked about white privilege, those of us who have white privilege, is to ask, are we seeing this achievement gap as a deficit in the sense that these kids over there have deficits that we have to fix? Or are we understanding that the whole system isn't functioning well? So for instance, these kids that got put off into this substantially separate classroom, I imagine some of them took on themselves also the sense of, well, I'm somehow something's wrong with me because I'm here. A deficit model. And part of what we want to see are the ways in which kids actually, each of us has gifts. That goes back to the story of the Sneetches, right? It's not the star on your belly or not the star on your belly. So I had a couple things I was thinking about as myths. One is that it's not about deficits, it's about making room for unique gifts. And when we tend to think in terms of deficits that need to be made up with kids, we tend to miss the strengths that they're bringing into the classroom, and that's really important to see. It's also very important, I think, around the racial stuff to recognize that poverty plays a huge issue in this. If you look in U.S. history about the times in which the achievement gap was less big, maybe that's the way to put it, where it narrowed. Part of that were times when we had big poverty programs in place. We were really trying to engage poverty. But poverty is not the only issue. So I think this is one of the things that's courageous about St. Paul, is recognizing that race is an issue, right? And one of the things that when we actually began to see how important it is to engage race and the diversity that comes in differences as gifts rather than deficits, that helps everybody, so that it doesn't just help the kids. I wonder if you could say a little bit more even about that.
Well, that certainly was at the forefront of the changes that happened this summer when we had staff meetings. We talked about the courageous conversations. Is this kind of code words which mean to have these conversations that you're normally not allowed to have, or not allowed to have, but just aren't encouraged. And we think kind of like we're post-racial, and so we just put that over here, and then we don't have to talk about it anymore because we're done with that. We just talk about a myth. But the staff meetings that we would start out with owning your racial identity and speaking your racial truth. And for some people that was very uncomfortable. For other people, it was like, finally, we're going to talk about this. And so as a staff, we would meet and say, I'm Eric, and as a white male and all the privilege that comes along with that, here's my experience and how I relate to students. And you talked about white privilege last week, and that's certainly something we've talked about. And I don't know if you talked about the Peggy McIntosh, the Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack.
Last week. Okay. That's a great one.
That's a great piece if you've never
That's a very famous classic.
Seen that, right? And so we use that as a kind of a model to start with, and everybody kind of filled out a survey based on their racial experience and how you interact with the world and your community through your racial lens. And based on these questions, they had a point value, and you said, okay, everyone stand up, and if you got between 0 and 10, line up over here, and if you're 120, over here. And what you saw was very clearly racial lines all the way down. And so that got this conversation started, which, as it relates to students, is if we can talk about it as staff, what are our racial differences, what are our strengths, what are our deficits, what are our surpluses, then we can really look through that lens at students and serve them better than just saying, oh, we have an achievement gap, and I hope that goes away.
Yeah, and one of the things about doing that, one of the things about seeing, that each of us brings gifts is that all of a sudden we are open to a wider range of ways of learning. one of the things that the East Metro Integration District schools have focused on have been arts and music. And one of the things that I have been so impressed by is watching like the orchestra at Crosswinds, which is the middle school program, this set of kids who don't have private lessons, who get their instruments from the school, going and winning competitions in New York City and in Chicago and all this kind of stuff. And you watch them when they have the statewide stuff where the winning orchestras get to come and play in Orchestra Hall, and you watch the Crosswinds Orchestra kids whose uniform is black pants and white shirt, right? So there are multiple versions of black pants and white shirt, and these kids are very, very different. And then you would look at the big schools from some of the suburban contexts that are very white who come in with all the matching outfits. And you watch it, and I think, wow, these kids. I mean, there's something about giving them permission to recognize each other's giftedness that's really created this marvelous opportunity. And I think maybe the courageous conversations, part of what might be coming out of some of that in St. Paul is this willingness to say, wait a minute. So when you look at the public discussions about the achievement gap, ask questions about, are we asking this, are we seeing things only as what's wrong with some kids? Are we making it only the issue of these teachers? Like right now, a lot of the discussion around the achievement gap as well, you know, if we did a better job with what, merit pay for teachers or those kinds of things, rather than asking, how's the whole community holding these kids? Right? How is the whole community contributing to what's happening or what's not happening? And are we seeing each other's giftedness?
Yeah, I think that that brings up a great point, too, about some of the myths that we talked about previously of suburban school districts that are doing well and urban districts that are not doing well, and, well, we just don't have better teachers. Or one thing you hear a lot is parent engagement and the culture of poverty, right? And so you write it off as, what's commonly written off is, well, the parents just don't care, the parents aren't there, and these are myths, and we need to unlearn these myths and talk about what the truth is. And in fact, if you look at some of the statistics, the parents of students in urban school districts and in St. Paul in particular are working more hours than their suburban counterparts. Some of the myths are, well, you know, they're really wrapped up in substance abuse or alcohol issues, and the truth is the rates are lower than suburban or
yeah, that's
parents.
A really important one.
And so some of those myths that just make it really easy for people to say, it's just too hard to deal with this. We can't, it's too difficult. There are all these issues, and sort of that culture of poverty, which I kind of cringe when I hear that. I kind of encourage people to challenge that myth that there is no culture of poverty, and that the parents would like to be as engaged as other parents. They, you know, have challenges that they can't. And so just kind of having the conversation about those things, get people to, you know, I hope that people kind of think about looking at that through a different lens.
I wonder maybe if any of you actually have stories you'd like to share from your own experience or questions. I mean, I think the other thing it's important for us to say is that courageous conversations, sometimes the reason they're called courageous is because we have deep questions that we want to ask that we're afraid of asking. And it's better to ask them and figure out how to engage them than not. So we kind of like to see if you guys have stories you want to tell.
Hi, as one of those educators from a suburban district, I totally agree with you that our special ed students should be in the mainstream classroom as much as possible. But if I look back, not that long ago, I used to have support with those students, and my class ratio, student-teacher ratio, was much smaller. A class of 30 was large, now 40 is normal. And so as a teacher, we're asked to do more and more with less and less. And they took away buses for after-school programs. So parents that need to work and cannot pick up their kids, that's an issue. I more and more use computer resources with my students to augment the classroom. That's the real world. They need to understand and be able to use that. But every time I assign it, I know there are some kids that do not have computers at home or do not have internet access and need a ride to the library in order to make that happen. So the inequity is the part that I struggle with. And I think my district has done, District 196 has done a lot to call attention to the white privilege and the issues of race in our district and understand that we have an achievement gap. But I haven't seen the money where the thought is. They're not really doing anything to address it as far as I can see. They just expect us to do more. And I don't know if you have any insight as to how to turn that around. But
Well, I will say one thing, and that's that I think communities have to get together and begin to recognize how much educating our kids matters, even if you don't have kids in the schools anymore, or even if you've I mean, one of the problems I think about advocacy for public education is that an awful lot of middle class and upper middle class folks took their kids out of the schools, out of the public schools, and put them into other kinds of settings, private schools and parochial schools, which is maybe great for those kids, but the problem is that it also removed those parents from the public school advocacy realm. So when we see, when we have a hard time, I mean, the state is finally paying back the money that it borrowed from the schools, but in borrowing money from the schools, it's not even a matter of borrowing it, they should have been funding them better. So the kinds of challenges you're talking about, I mean, my sister's a first grade teacher in Wisconsin, and she lives with kids in her classroom who really need special ed services, and the school won't even refer them, basically, for testing. And that's, I mean, these are big challenges, but I also want to say that there's energy and hope involved when the community gathers together to engage them. And I think sometimes we think the problems are so big we can't do anything about them. But you've got some great stories about. Well,
I mean, Vita, talk to your question brings up a really great point. I mean, the challenges are seemingly harder than ever, and I can speak to St. Paul, the experience we have there, which is where we have a principal who this year is very aggressive in saying we have these challenges and we've always had these challenges, but we're going to meet them. We're no longer going to say, well, the parents aren't here, we don't have transportation and stuff, and that's the truth, but we've really been kind of digging in, at least in my school, as a staff, to say, like, how are we getting these kids to after-school programs, how are we getting them home, and the challenges seem to be mounting. I can only agree with you. So it's certainly very, very difficult.
There are examples, though, again, I mean, the E-Mid schools, I'll just speak from my own experience. So Crosswinds has one of the highest percentage of kids on IEPs of any of the surrounding district schools, but one of the lowest pullout rates. And that's partly because they've figured out a way to do a different kind of culture in the school. But they've had to work at that, and they've had to be very conscious about what does integration mean. And I'm not sure that all schools have the opportunity to even have the conversations, let alone think about how to do that. And, again, in terms of myths, I mean, I think another thing is that we have a tendency to think that we're going to, if we pay attention to these gaps and we fix the deficits, well, at least we'll get to some kind of normal space. And I think instead what we need to do is recognize the gifts that live in the midst of these communities and figure out how to have all of us benefit from it. So for white people engaging racism and dismantling racism, we actually benefit from that. We have white privilege, which benefits us in the structures, but if you actually start engaging with the community to make a difference, you begin to realize how much energy is in that and how much caring for the common good brings you into something that's bigger than what you had before. Some of you talked last week about the civil rights movement and the work. We were listening to Pete Seeger. That's another piece of it. What does it mean to be in the struggle together? So it's not just the teacher's problem, right? It's not just individual teachers' problems to solve, but it's something a whole community can work on. I think we're losing some of our experience with what that is. We need to reclaim some of that. Other stories or questions?
I'm Laura. So for some reason, I grew up at 110th and Russell in Bloomington, my childhood, and I've been concerned about this whole, white, black thing since just a little girl. And I've been watching this, elementary school started in '62. I've been watching this all this time, and I'm somebody that media-wise, I'm just constantly watching, and I'm so glad that finally the images have shifted. I mean, every single commercial I go, and every TV show I go, and you can really see, producers that make a difference in that. And then the whole thing about social class. I wound up in a homeless shelter with my two really young daughters. I was out east, and and I said, I'm not just white, my kids have red hair, a very strong Puerto Rican population out there, and so I've really lived this thing, and the whole stigma around being homeless, and I did a lot of advocacy work on, being the poster child of, this is what homelessness looks like. It's a daughter of an upper middle class family with the 2 kids, and girls don't get to go home. Boys get to go home, but girls don't. So I'm glad that a lot of that stuff has shifted. That's 20 years ago now. But just very aware of that, and also just recently being diagnosed with ADHD, that whole thing is just starting to shift, and the mental health stuff is starting to shift. So I'm sure all of that helps, but that's still another 20 years for
Well,
schools,
and
I know.
one of the things it reminds me of is the way in which we also all can contribute. I mean, when you started by talking about media, and I was thinking about the huge outcry this last week over the television commercial that aired during the Super Bowl, that I thought it was beautiful. Actually, I was in tears. It was this America the Beautiful Coke ad where they were singing America the Beautiful in multiple languages. To me, that was this wonderful lifting up of the diversity of what it is to be American, but there was a lot of anger and frustration in parts of the country about it not being American. And I think that's a place where, again, communities of faith talking to each other and their neighbors and their friends and lifting up and saying, wait a minute, this is who we are, not this, right? There was a piece I was reading yesterday, actually, about a woman talking about a middle-class woman who had a very high-level paying job as a systems administrator in a company here in Minnesota, and the company changed over its computer systems, and she lost her job. And she's 58, and she's having a very hard time finding another job, and she's about to lose her house. And you get these, and you begin to think, wait a second, this is somebody who did all the things they were supposed to do, and the system is still not working. So at some point, if we can ask ourselves, and I think that's the hymns you were singing today, All Are Welcome, the text that Jay was reading from Galatians, those are core commitments to understanding that we are all part of a body together. And the more that we can resist being turned into, fighting against each other, and instead say, wait a second, this is something that the whole needs to pay attention to, the better off we're going to be. For the kids in the St. Paul schools to say, wait a second, these kids have value, these kids are bright, these kids have some challenges, but let's figure out how to put them together.
Just some of the imagery stuff that just in our school at Obama, we talked about, people would come from room to room and take a look around and see what are kids seeing visually, and teachers that were really well-meaning had pictures of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and a lot of white males in this classroom, right? And so really intentionally putting up images that reflect the experiences of the students. And for kids that are just, all educators know this, but as soon as you walk into a classroom, the learning starts, right? Even before then, on the bus. But, walking in, do these images reflect who I am and my culture and what I come from? And we took a big look at that. And when you walk into classrooms at Obama now, you'll see pictures that you're not used to seeing in classrooms, which is really refreshing. And so that, I agree that imagery is really important, and it is changing. So
I'm an administrator in St. Paul, and one of the things that I do is I work with early education. Actually, the thing I do is work with early education and trying to make some of these shifts, because the achievement gap, which could also be looked at as the achievement opportunities, or the opportunity gap, it's called. But when I started this equity work about 5 years ago, I also went through the color line of standing in the line where it was very clearly a color line between the white and the darker skinned people that were in our school district. And trying to understand what my lens is was probably the hardest part for me, because I used to think, when I first started teaching, we had one African American child in our classroom, and he was adopted, and he lived in a white middle class family, and his daddy was a minister, was our pastor. And he was a great child, and yet somebody on the bus in this 4-year-old group of children said to me one day, he's black, he's ugly. Mm-hmm. And I said, in my white wisdom, he's just like the rest of us. It's just the same, he's just like us. Because that's what I thought as a white privileged woman, that he was just like us. What I didn't know until about 5-6 years ago, really intensely, was he's not. He has a whole different experience because he has a different skin color. We had 273 students that were 5-year-olds that were suspended from school by October of last year in kindergarten. 278 across the district. 5-year-olds, they hadn't been in school for 2 months, and they've been suspended at least once. Obama is one of our schools. This year, we decided, based on what we know about, not just about the racial gap and the racism that's going on in St. Paul, we have a really huge systemic racism problem. It's not about the kids and families, it's about us. It's about how we generate educational programming and what we expect of kids. From the minute they walk in the door, they are expected to sit down, be quiet, listen to teachers, do what I say. And in African American families, typically you go to the churches that they're used to going to, and please tell me if I'm wrong, those of you who are here, add to it. You go to church and they shout out, they add to, they join the group, they join the choir. We wait for people to tell us to stand up and talk. We wait and be quiet when everybody is quiet. It's very different the way that African American grandmas read stories to their children and their grandchildren versus the way we read stories. We expect our children, to a certain extent in white culture, and that's changing, but to be quiet when we read, to listen to our stories and talk to us when we ask questions. That's not how it is in other cultures. And for us to change that and to help people understand that 5-year-olds shouldn't be suspended from school because they shout out, because they jump up, because they engage in the learning in a different way, that was wrong for us to think. We changed our curriculum. We rewrote the entire curriculum with a team of 20 people last year for kindergarten. We went into 20 out of 42 elementary schools, and we changed the model, the time of day, and really taught teachers for 2 weeks this summer, how do you engage with all of the students in your classrooms? What does it look like, and how do they bring not just their gifts, but who they are to the story? Their stories get to come into the classroom. And I have to tell you, this year, and out of those 273 kids, 70% of them were African American boys. That's our racism. And that was clear to us. This year, in the 20 schools, not the 22 that don't have this new model, the 20 schools that we have changed the way people are thinking about kindergarten, there was a 75% drop in suspension rates by November.
Wow, that's a great statistic.
In those schools.
And yeah, and we're going to see the payoff down the road of that too. That's just this year. So you have those students that are suspended as 5-year-olds. Their experience was right to special ed, right? And they maybe threw a chair or did something when they were 5 years old, and they never, and they in the old model they would never see the inside of a general ed classroom again. That was the end for them. And now, if you take this 5 years down the road, these students who I deal with 9, 10, 11-year-olds who they grew up in these programs. Imagine 5 years from now, students who are not in these programs. I mean, the payoff is going to continue, I believe, down the road exponentially. So that's a great statistic, and thanks for your work. It's been great.
The halls now, and last year there were kids running up and down the halls. There were angry people. There were teachers yelling. This year I go in the hallway, and I have kindergarten teachers who come out and give me hugs and cry and say, I work really hard, extra hard this year because this works, and I don't know how to do it yet, but I'm going to figure it out because it works. My kids are happy. My kids are not in the office. And it's part of their story that gets to show up in the curriculum and who they are.
That's a wonderful story.
I work in the kindergarten classroom at Roosevelt, one of the schools that has the new curriculum. And I just wanted to say that my school also has a very, very big sense of community as far as when it comes to talking about equity. We have a multicultural center, which is parents, elders, it's in the building, but it's a separate area. So we get involved in cultural nights, parents' nights. Our parents, we send them a newsletter every week with saying to parents, come in, be with your kids, come to lunch, come to breakfast with your kids. So when we have our meetings and our professional developments, the Multicultural Center, the elders and the people that work in that center are all welcome to come to staff meetings. Even though they're not teachers, they're integrated and they do make sure that we're having the courageous conversations that are required for us to talk about this. I grew up in a suburban upper class school, and so for me growing up, kind of like what my mom said, it it was all about not acknowledging that somebody of a different color was different. You kind of pretended like it was, they're exactly the same as you. So it was very difficult for me to start in school and having these courageous conversations, saying to these kids, you are different. Show us how you're different. Show us how we can acknowledge this with everybody. So I think the bottom line is, it's not that everybody's the same. It's that you are a different color, you're a different culture, you have a different cultural background, different relationships, and getting those people to show us how we can become more of a community.
Well, and getting us to be, I mean, that's, last week we talked about the difference between being color blind and color amazed. I mean, I think it's something about the richness of what is it to be a part of a really diverse community, which we have the gift of. We can just see each other in it.
I hate to be the hook, but I'm going to be.